and welcome to the session before lunch. I'm Virginie O'Shea. I'm the founder of a capital markets research and advisory business called Firebrand Research, and I'm joined by Nathalie Zegmouli, who's Director of Sales in Europe for Quantum Solutions. And on my right, I have Duncan Cooper back here again.
Heard enough from me.
Mr. Data Hokey Cokey, as I'm going to call you from now on, Head of Omni Digital Services at Bank of New York Mellon. And we're here to complete your buzzword bingo this morning. We're going to be talking about AI, RPA, and ML. I feel like we've been talking a lot about robotics and RPA over the last decade, right? We've, I guess, seen armies of bots being deployed by various financial institutions, and I think we've probably learned a lot of lessons as a result of that. Maybe they're not going to replace people, and you end up having more IT staff than operations staff. Might be one lesson from my perspective. Duncan, what do you think we've learned?
I think the thing we've all learned is that if you think it's going to be easy, it won't be. You kind of touched on that really interesting point that you're just swapping operations staff for bot herders, for want of a better description. I always like to define the differences between AI, RPA and ML because it's a really tricky area. But RPA, it's when you have a set of given inputs, you get the same output every single time. AI and ML is where you get the same inputs, you won't get the same output every time. So RPA, very simple. If you press button 1, you'll get something coming out the other end. And I think what we're seeing is probably the peak of what you can do with RPA at the moment. Everybody rushed into it, potentially without thinking about some of the challenges that are going to be there, which is it's a really difficult kind of topic to breach the first time, and there's a lot of learning experiences around it. I would say that now we kind of know how to deploy RPA successfully, but not necessarily getting any more returns from it. We kind of hit that peak of, yeah, we can use RPA, we know where to use it, there's probably not much more that we can add to it.
Sure. Natalie?
Indeed, I mean, you're very right. For the time being, when we were talking about digitalization, we were focusing on paperless and automation. And that's what RPA is doing. But AI and ML is much broader than that. If I can take the car analogy, we've had enough today, it's like having a Ferrari and driving on a side road on a village and not using the full. So AI is like a pool of the most powerful brains, an endless pool of those brains, and the ML enables you to update, enhance without human being intervention. So here again, the learning, it's a learning curve, constant and endless. And when we look at the industry, we've been very much focusing at the first part, automation, but we have underestimated, or at least we have not invested enough yet in the machine learning and what it can do. And I think we also undersee what it can bring still now, but yeah.
And I think we often overestimate what we can do with certain technologies without... You started this morning talking about looking at the business and not looking at the technology. Often, if you go at it backwards, as we do, and think about the technology and try and solve any problem that you can with it, it's not going to work, right? So AI is a really big buzzword. It's all tied up in this digital transformation stuff that everyone's been talking about. But expectations versus reality. Natalie, actually, I'm going to start with you. Where do you think we sort of measure up on that front?
As just mentioned, we're still far away. So if I could just mention something in AI, or let's jump backwards. RPA is about automation of a process. AI is about automation of the decision-making within the process. So we've been automated the process. Now we can automate slowly the decision-making process within the post-trade industry. So, but the challenges are huge. We all face AI daily in our life. I mean, I was amazed last weekend. I had a picture. My iPhone showed me a picture from 2 people on their backs and said to me, "Do you want me to send this picture to Mary?" And basically, it was Mary's back. A best friend of mine. And I was like, wow, AI implemented by Google and Apple is far from what we can do. And there's a lot we can do in order to improve. The issue we are facing, we mentioned already this morning, is the post-trade is struggling with budget. That's still the reality. The budget we have is focused first on regulatory and mandatory projects and implementations. The post-trade is still very inefficient. We're all facing a very heavy infrastructure. We talked about the legacy. I'm not even talking about the duplication of core banking system due to mergers and acquisitions. So we have those heavy legacy behind us. And when we start thinking at AI, because it's very difficult to assess the return on investment, everyone gets cold feet when starting looking at that. And it's, as we say in French, we are hiding behind our little finger. It's easier to keep a status quo rather than start something which is going to be highly costly, risky, and will take time. And I'm not talking about the budget. So that's where we are. So everyone is acknowledging the fact that AI is the future. We all have to go there. We know that we cannot go without it, but somehow we still struggle to find the right people, maybe, may I say, courageous enough to fight for it and go for it, because it's easier for the time being to just keep what we have.
Sure, that's a very good point. I mean, you can think of Google and you can think of Amazon, you think of Elon Musk. They can afford literal moonshots, right? Operations, we don't have that flexibility, unfortunately. No. Very good point on that front. Duncan, I want to bring you in on this topic.
Yeah, it's one of my pet peeves, annoyances, I suppose. When you look at AI, I tend to talk about an anti-pattern, and an organisation I used to work for, when they started looking at artificial intelligence, the first thing they did was they went out and hired about 30 data scientists. And data scientists, if you know, are very expensive. They all come with lots of letters after their name, and they tend to be very focused on a lot of abstract mathematical topics, which is brilliant. They're absolute rocket scientists in terms of this sort of stuff. But the problem for this particular organisation is that they were going for the 21st century data scientists, and they had steam-powered data. And the two just didn't correlate. You know, they were looking at data in Excel spreadsheets, in old Oracle databases, tucked away in filing cabinets, and they were trying to produce data insights out of this. That particular organisation had spent a huge amount of money on exactly the wrong place. They'd spent it all on the end result, and they hadn't put the foundations in. So for me, and I would say this, I'm biased straight away. I like data, and data for me is the most important aspect. But if you can't get those data foundations right, whatever you build on top of it is likely to give you spurious correlations. Essentially, artificial intelligence that isn't that intelligent. And that's not what anyone wants to invest money in.
Sure, there's that whole thing of the garbage in, garbage out, right? And it's been said so many times, unfortunately, I feel like a cliche saying it, but it's certainly very important to bear in mind that it's not intelligent if you're putting information in that's incorrect. You can't do very much with it. You need high volumes of it. It takes a really long time to train those models as well. So you have to think about these things before you go into these programs. It takes quite a lot of planning, and it also data scientists on one side, but also connecting with the business. That's another thing that I think, common mistake, and certainly I've done a lot of research on this over the years, but innovation programs tend to fail if you can't connect this ivory tower of people working on innovation with your business users. And there can be resentment between the two, which brings politics into it, unfortunately, right?
Oh yeah, someone's got the budget, and they're going to go and spend it on their particular interest, and it doesn't necessarily equate to what they're investing in as the outcome, as the best return on that investment. Typically because they don't have the data on the operations and the business processes to actually direct them in the right place for that best payoff. So AI is really cool, but if you focus where it's invested and base it on the data that you have in your organisation first, you'll probably get a better return from it than if you just go off there hunting for unicorns, as we would say in the UK.
Sure, very good point. And I wanted to ask an audience poll question, but we couldn't, unfortunately, with the technology. But I hope you're all awake out there, because I noticed we haven't had many audience questions over the last couple of sessions. So I want to invite them now, if possible. So please do stick your hand up. We're here to talk about AI and ML and anything to do with ops, so it should be relevant to you guys.
Great. So, I think as you alluded to, most of us, our experience of AI at the moment is a use case where we feel like we're being stalked by Google or Facebook or whatever. So I'm just really interested to know if you're, we're starting with a blank sheet of paper, what use case in post-trade would you apply AI to first?
Do you want to go first, Duncan?
Or do you?
Oh, no, Natalie?
Natalie, please.
Yep.
I would say whatever you feel as a priority. It can be implemented everywhere. So if I take a concrete example, we have on the corporate actions, we all have been talking about golden copies, cleansing and scrubbing, comparing from different custodians, etc. What we've started to do is also enhance those golden copies with extract from other sources, from Google, taking some companies' data to enhance the golden copy for the customers. Where we have also applied AI is on the instruction side of the corporate actions, where our clients, for some specific events, can already have a predetermined instructions based on the previous behavior and the event types. So you can really think of all the full-fledged. It's not only on the simple transaction monitoring and producing fancy analytics, whatever predictive, prescriptive, but you can really put AI in all spectrum. Even, and I go back to what I've said earlier, it's the automation of the decision-making process.
From my side, no exact examples, so sorry to let you down there. But I would tend to think you're looking at use cases that will fall into one or two buckets. One to reduce your operational cost, or one to mitigate a risk. And I would tend to focus more on the mitigation of risk. So things like financial crime, regulatory reporting, the stuff that, hopefully it works perfectly all the time. But when it goes wrong, you could be really up the creek. If you focus on reducing cost as the first use case, I tend to think you're then driving everything that you talk about around cost reduction. And as a first thing, the first pioneer project for you, that will never be as cheap or as simple or as easy as you expect it. So that tends to put you in a bad position of looking to reduce costs straight away. And it doesn't really reduce costs because it's a really complex project. The risk side tends to have a bit of a better benefit payoff. But that's just my experience. That doesn't mean it's right for every firm.
And I can add on this, actually, to be honest, because I've been looking at it in ops. I'd say in terms of successful areas, it tends to be, again, it's not to do with cost reduction because it ends up costing more than you expect it to. 90% of the time, largely because you're having to use lots of internal resources. The ops team are generally having to train these models. I always think of it as RuPaul having to train. I think of model training. I think of, you have Tyra Banks, all of these things in reality TV. They spend a lot of training models. Expect that from your project in AI. You're going to spend a lot of time with those models, unfortunately. But when it comes to successful use cases, think about how good AI is at pattern recognition, correlating lots of different data sets. And as long as that data is usable, which again is what Duncan was talking about, then you can spot a lot of different things. And that can be transactional data, it can be reconciliation improvements, it can be spotting bottlenecks before they happen. So your operations teams are being augmented rather than replaced. I think that's key, is not seeing this as a threat, but merely as a support to your ops team.
Yeah. And to a point you mentioned earlier, is it going to replace us or not? AI is here to, again, automate the errors, and the people are going to be here, and we need them in order to strategize. So instead of correcting what I would say maybe boring and doing reconciliations or correcting errors, they will be focused at value-added tasks, and that cannot yet be replaced by AI and ML.
Fantastic. Any more questions?
I have always, of course, a question coming from a risk perspective. Again, the boring thing. In this environment where we are constantly being more threatened by cyber hacking and so very, very advanced cyber hacking, does AI make us more vulnerable? I guess it's more difficult to hack me as a human person sitting there than it is to hack. What's your view on that?
I actually have quite strong views on this, so I can say
Please.
that, because I've been talking to Chief Information Security Officers over the last few months, and they're using AI to spot entry points, so pattern correlation, correlating data in attack vectors. And once a cyber attacker comes into your organisation, because eventually they're always successful at some point, it can help you deal with that problem as well. So I'd say yes, it can be a threat, because obviously cyber criminals are innovative.
But also a support tool or a way of mitigating. That's a good idea.
Definitely a tool to advance. You split it into two things. You've got the data and you've got the algorithm. Mm-hmm. The data, your risk exposure is always going to be the same, whether it's an AI or an analyst or just standard reporting. The algorithm is always a potential attack vector to get some sort of spurious correlation produced. And if someone knows how that AI algorithm is going to react, then they can bet against it. So that's always the place where I would focus the interest on, is what the algorithm is doing as opposed to the underlying data.